Soviet hardliner Yegor Ligachev lashed out today at what he calls the thoughtless radicalism of the past 5 years of the Soviet leader Gorbachev's reforms. At this second day of the Communist Party Congress in Moscow, Ligachev said he is not against perestroika as a whole, but he added perestroika without the Communist Party is hopeless.
Well, as we know, Mr. Gorbachev is attempting to prevent the breakup of the Communist Party, but even if he succeeds, he will still have to face the possible dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. Separatist movements in some of the 15 Soviet republics are challenging Moscow's authority with increasing fervor. Last January, threat of all comes from the Russian Republic, where lawmakers threw down a challenge last month. They passed a non-binding measure asserting the primacy of Russian law over Soviet law. Russian President Boris Yeltsin is pushing for greater control over the raw materials in the Union's biggest and richest republic. Journalist Bohdan Nahaylo has written extensively about Soviet affairs. He is the co-author of a new book called Soviet Disunion, a history of the nationalities problem in the USSR. Mr. Nahaylo also is a senior research analyst for Radio Liberty, the U.S. government broadcast service. And he joins us from our studios in Washington this morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Dom.
In your opinion, how weakened, let's try to put some perspective on this, how weakened is the Soviet empire by these nationalistic movements?
Well, I'd like to start off by saying that we have to be very careful when we talk about nationalism, nationalistic movements. It's not simply a question of chauvinistic extremist groups trying to somehow make things difficult for Mr. Gorbachev. What we have to bear in mind is that we're seeing a process of imperial decay, a major empire beginning to fall apart. And these various movements represent the pent-up frustrations and aspirations of entire nations that have been suppressed for decades. So the bottom line today is that you cannot have genuine democratization and perestroika and at the same time try to retain an anachronistic empire.
Well, as these movements do chip away at the unity of the Soviet Union now, where will this lead? What will happen to the Soviet Union? Can it be preserved in another form?
This is the crucial question. Moscow would like to retain the empire. It's seeking new forms, new labels, new ways of making the preservation of this huge entity somehow acceptable to the non-Russians. The non-Russians 2 or 3 years ago had already said that unless they were offered a new deal, the sort of new deal that Lenin offered the non-Russians in the early 1920s, on the basis of which the USSR was created, that unless these proclaimed rights of the theoretically sovereign non-Russian republics are respected, then the Russians want out. For the last 2 or 3 years, Gorbachev has been very slow on making any sort of major concessions to the non-Russians, and it may be too late now to win back the trust and loyalty of at least the major non-Russian nations.
Boris Yeltsin is a central figure in all of this, and some would say perhaps the biggest threat in many ways. What does he want?
Boris Yeltsin wants basic rights for the Russians themselves. This is the great paradox of the Soviet empire, that the Russians have been the dominant nation. It has been their values and their culture that has been forcibly imposed on the non-Russians, and yet at the same time the Russians themselves have lost out because economically they are worse off than many of the non-Russian groups, and they feel that their own institutions have been neglected. Boris Yeltsin wants, as a shrewd politician, first and foremost, wants to harness these patriotic Russian forces. Boris Yeltsin, however, is on record as having expressed his sympathy for the aspirations of the Balts, the Ukrainians, the Moldavians, and others. And it remains to be seen now whether he can still at the same time be receptive to the needs of the non-Russians and at the same time satisfy his massive Russian constituency.
You recently sat in on the Supreme Soviet's talks about Lithuanian independence, and as we know, recently a moratorium was declared on that independence movement. Do you think a compromise will be reached?
Well, a temporary compromise has been reached, but this is, of course, no solution. The Lithuanians have been forced by economic measures to give way temporarily, but the ball is now in Moscow's court. Gorbachev has to do something. He has to deliver at least a new union treaty. Let us remember that 6 months ago he rejected out of hand the need for any new union treaty. He is being forced to retreat, And the crucial question is, can he actually come up with some face-saving device that will retain the unity of the Soviet Empire? The Lithuanians and many other non-Russian groups don't want to be part of this system anymore. It's not simply the Communist Party that's bankrupt, it's the entire system that's bankrupt.
Very briefly, because we are running out of time, will the Soviet Union lose the Baltic states?
In the long run, I think it may lose not only the Baltic states, but now that national feeling is on the rise in Ukraine, the crucial republic, the largest of the non-Russian groups, I think we are seeing the inevitable now process of imperial disintegration.
Thank you very much for joining us today on World Day. We've been talking with journalist and Soviet expert Bohdan Nahaylo. He is the co-author of the book Soviet Disunion, A History of the Nationalities Problem in the USSR. And we thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Bobby.
Reed?